Alcat's Rogue Trader marks Warhammer's first foray into the CRPG genre, and I personally couldn't be happier with it. I'm not even the biggest fan of CRPGs in general, but the compelling story, satisfying combat, and interesting characters make this game something really good. And a game like this feels long overdue for 40k, a setting with almost 40 years of lore behind it. Warhammer games have certainly been no stranger to RPG elements within them, but the role-playing has never been a huge focus of them. Much like Boltgun, Rogue Trader feels like it fills a gap in the 40k game lineup that the property has been missing for years. It's so bizarre to me that this is the first ever Warhammer CRPG, whether it be 40k or fantasy. Both settings have incredibly rich lore and worlds that would have made for games that would not have felt out of place alongside the ones that D&D got in the 90s. But for some reason we never got that. There's no Warhammer equivalent to Eye of the Beholder. Instead, Games Workshop was far more focused on the strategy and action market for Warhammer, putting out games like Space Hulk, Chaos Gate, and Shadow of the Horned Wrath. But despite Warhammer's lacking presence in the CRPG space, that doesn't mean that Warhammer was completely uninvolved in role-playing. Games Workshop initially got its start as the UK distributor of Dungeons & Dragons in the 70s, and when that license went up and GW started making their own games, the DNA of D&D was clear to see in the early editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battles and 40k. 40k's first edition famously recommends the use of a game master to function as a referee and to spring surprises on the players. And despite it dropping the need for a GM long ago, modern 40k still has some of that roleplay DNA running in its veins. I mean, do you think that you can choose war gear options just because GW knows how much you love to micromanage stuff? No, it's because GW understands that a core part of Warhammer's appeal is that it's ultimately about your dudes, the battles that they go through, and the emergent stories that play out on the tabletop. So really, it was only a matter of time before we got something like Rogue Trader. But if you've played through Rogue Trader back to front and you want more games like it, well, you're kinda stuck. As I said earlier, Warhammer had a big focus on strategy and action games, leaving a fairly underserved RPG market. So what do you do if you want more 40k RPG content in your life? You could certainly cross your fingers and hope for DLC for Rogue Trader, but I think I have a better solution. Turn to the wide selection of 40k TTRPGs on offer. Yes, 40k has had its fair share of role-playing games over the years, and with the relatively recent release of Rogue Trader, I feel like now's a good time to go over some that may be worth your time if you're craving more 40k RPG content in your life. As an aside, I'm not going to touch on every single thing that these RPGs have to offer. I don't have the time to do an in-depth review of each and every single system, because if I did that, we would be here all day. I just want to cover the gist of each system, enough to kickstart your interest into looking further into them. That being said though, I do want to briefly touch on some things that are fairly consistent across these systems that I like, just so I'm not stuck repeating myself. First up, D100s. I love D100 systems with all of my heart. I appreciate how it lets players know what they're capable of and how much more granular they are than like a D20. Just being able to look at my sheet and go, oh yeah, I have a 50% chance to succeed on this test, just click something in my brain that I really like. Next up, character leveling. Across the 40k RPGs, character leveling is consistently really good. At the end of each session, you get experience points, and you can use those points to buy upgrades to your skills or new talents for your character. As a result, you're never stuck waiting around for a level up, and it feels like your characters are improving every session. Lastly, combat is probably my favorite thing in these RPGs, as it is super crunchy and impactful. The 40k RPGs have a good depth of rules to their combat, and it feels really satisfying no matter what your build is. Additionally, combat can get really brutal, but critically, it never feels unfair. I guess what I'm trying to say is that 40k RPGs are the Dark Souls of RPGs! Oh god, kill me. Also, critical wound charts. I love the critical wound charts. Well, with that out of the way, let's talk some RPG systems. The first one up is the obvious one, Rogue Trader, the rule set that Alcat adapted into, well, Rogue Trader. So that should be it, right? I mean, why is there this much time left in the video? How long does it take to say, if you liked Rogue Trader, you should play Rogue Trader. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a bomb in my mailbox. Well, you see, it's a complicated issue. There's a lot of factors to consider when recommending an RPG to someone besides just the obvious choice. I mean, it could be personal taste, my knowledge of the system, the fact that Rogue Trader isn't very good, publication history. I mean, any one of those could be the reason why I'm getting Rogue Trader out of the way this early. But let's just get into the premise. So in Rogue Trader, players are put into the roles of crew members that are part of a Rogue Trader dynasty, specifically roles that would be part of a Rogue Trader's personal entourage, such as the Seneschal, Archmilitant, or Astropath. The game is set in the far reaches of Imperial space in the Coronis Expanse, and it's your job to sail this expanse in search of fortune and glory. Thankfully, out here, both can be found in spades. As part of a Rogue Trader dynasty, you are one of the select few people that can live free of the laws of the Imperium. You generally don't have to worry about any authority cracking down on you, so you're free to do stuff like recruit Xeno mercenaries, stare too long at a Chaos artifact, or plug in an HDMI cord without saying the Mechanicus approved prayer first. As a Rogue Trader crew, you're really free to do whatever you want, and as such, it makes for a game that feels a lot more freeform. You get to be on that be your own boss grind set that's normally sold by pyramid schemes and Romanian sex criminals. Except unlike your worst cousin that keeps falling for that stuff, Rogue Traders actually are their own boss. The general vibe of Rogue Trader can pretty much be summed up as,
do what you want cause a pirate is free, you are a pirate!
Okay, so what do I like about Rogue Trader? Well, for one, I appreciate that it's a system essentially made for high-status player characters. There's a debate in the D&D community as to whether or not level 1 PCs should be remarkable or unique, but that debate is by no means happening in Rogue Trader. It's a game about playing incredibly important individuals, and I really like that. It's a system where for once, you are the shot callers. You are the ones that give people orders, not follow them. It also means that you get way more freedom on how you tackle obstacles. If a planetary governor is being a dick to you, you don't really have to deal with them. Sure, you can play along if you want to, but you also have the option to pack up and leave his crappy little planet. Or you could just send in a regiment of voidsmen to kidnap him from his palace and drag him onto your ship so you and him can work out your differences face to face. And I really like that about Rogue Trader. Certainly any RPG system worth its salt will let you choose how you want to approach an issue, but how many of them will let you start an all-out war because somebody might have implied your parents were lowborn scum? It also does a great job of conveying how obscenely rich Rogue Traders are. Like, you don't have Rolex money, you don't have Bentley money, you have paramilitary death squad money. Speaking of money and paramilitary death squads, that brings me to the next thing I like, acquisition tests. So in Rogue Trader, you don't really have money. Instead, the crew has something called a profit factor, which essentially represents the several bank vaults worth of treasure the ship is hauling around. Profit factor is an abstraction of that wealth, as if you had the actual amount of cash you had written down on your sheet, it would be a pool of money in the billions, if not trillions. The way that profit factor works is that whenever players want something, they don't just spend profit factor to get it. Instead, they compare both the rarity and the amount of the items they want against the crew's profit factor, then either add or subtract the relevant modifiers, and finally, they roll an acquisition test to see if they can acquire the item. Now, I know everything I just said sounds needlessly complex, but trust me, it's actually way easier done than said. You only have to do basic arithmetic, and in return it massively cuts down on your bookkeeping, as you don't have to actively keep track of every single amount of currency you spend. Due to it being a resource shared by everyone, Profit Factor also gives the crew a common goal to work towards, even if ultimately that goal is just to make loads of money! Lastly, Rogue Trader has some really cool additions to the lore, such as the minor Xenos in the Coronis Expanse like the Rock Ghoul and the Strixus. The Rock Ghoul are skittering 8-foot-tall nightmare creatures that resemble xenomorphs even more than the Tyranids do. But if xenomorphs were sapient, and had machine guns, and also chainsaw arms. As if that weren't bad enough, they're also piratical raiders in a similar vein to the Dark Eldar. Except unlike the Dark Eldar, who have the slightest justification for their torture, the Rock Ghoul just do it because they find it fun.
I'm killing you. I'm killing you. I don't care about anything else. I don't give a shit about anything else. My programming is just get that fucking guy right now.
Conversely, the Strixus are a relatively peaceful, if somewhat untrustworthy band of roaming traders. They're out in the Coronis Expanse for the same reason you are, to make money. But instead of looting and plundering, they mostly make their cash by selling folks whatever junk and firearms they can find. They're like an alien race composed entirely of the Merchant from Resident Evil 4.
What are you buying?
That's just scratching the surface of the cool minor Xenos of the Coronis Expanse. I haven't even mentioned stuff like the Bone Conqueror, Fossil Horror, or Yuvoth. It makes Rogue Trader really feel like a game that's set on the edge of Imperial space. While the staple Xenos are certainly present, you also see a lot of stuff that only really exists because it's on the fringe of Imperial space. Minor Xenos have essentially existed since the creation of 40k, but they've never really been fully capitalized on. So it's really cool to get a look at what else lurks out there besides what we have models and codices for. So all in all, Rogue Trader sounds pretty cool. Why wouldn't I recommend it? Well, the problem mostly comes down to the fact that Rogue Trader was really early into the whole 40k RPG thing, and had some clear teething issues that it still needed to work out. Rogue Trader was the second 40k RPG to exist, and the first that was developed in its entirety by Fantasy Flight Games. FFG did work on the core rules and published expansions for the first 40k RPG, Dark Heresy, but most of the development of that was handled by Games Workshop's own in-house RPG subdivision, Black Industries. You may recognize Black Industries from their work such as Dark Heresy 1st Edition, as well as closing down literally 2 days after the release of Dark Heresy 1st Edition. So when Black Industries went under, Fantasy Flight was sort of left to pick up the pieces of 40k RPGs, and it kind of shows with Rogue Trader. It came out only a year after Dark Heresy 1st Edition, and has a lot of things that make me feel like it was rushed to production. It's a very cobbled together RPG that has visible cracks in its foundation and a lot of stuff that sounds like a neat idea but just doesn't really work in practice. One example of that is character creation and how much it kinda sucks, mostly due to the origin path mechanic. The way that it works is that you're supposed to pick a home world and then move down the origin path along adjacent tiles. So starting from a hive world, you would move to here, 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 and finally here. Every player is supposed to go down the origin path, drawing lines over each other, these intersections representing opportunities for these shared paths to introduce role-playing between characters. It's a cool idea, but terrible in execution. The practical effect of the origin path is that it makes character creation overly restrictive and locks players from interesting options, since you can only take options that are adjacent to the tile you are currently on. Due to the way the path is laid out as well, some things are arbitrarily required or restricted. Rogue Traders and Astropaths get the worst of it, as each only has one motivation option. And Rogue Traders can't be from a death world, and Astropaths can never be noble-born for some reason. Additionally, the rules in this system just feel like they could have used revisions or additional playtesting. Stuff like how shooting weapons at higher fire rates gives you bigger bonuses to hit, with full auto fire giving you a plus 20% chance to hit your target. So the best strategy becomes to just spray and pray, which means in combat the air gets so thick with gunfire it clogs your nose. Influence tests are also kind of poorly thought out. It's meant to be a way for a rogue trader to sort of flash some cash and show they're a big shot in order to gain favor with other high-ranking Imperials. Basically a way to go,
"Oi, you! Shut your mouth and look at my wad! Loads of money!"
But the favor you gain is only a temporary bonus to interaction tests in the encounter, and failure is only a temporary hindrance. So the minuscule risk and reward are ultimately so inconsequential that you'll often forget influence tests are even a thing you can do. The system is full of stuff like this that I think maybe just one more playtest really would have ironed out. But in my opinion, the biggest issue with the system is how it handles rogue traders. The issue with the Rogue Trader class is that the game sort of encourages the narrative to be focused around the endeavors of whoever's playing the Rogue Trader. With the rest of the party being the subordinates of the trader, that can cause a little bit of an issue. At its best, it can make other players feel less important to the narrative, while at its worst, it can feel like you're playing someone else's Skyrim companions. Like, fuck having my own motivations, I just want to play as Lydia. While most RPG groups have a tendency to have one player sort of end up as the effective leader of the group, that typically isn't something that gets to be determined at character creation, and is usually something that emerges more organically through roleplay. What do you do if someone who thinks they want to be the rogue trader actually isn't very well suited for the job? Whether it be that they can't really take the initiative that's needed, or they just don't pay that much attention to what's going on. Meanwhile, the person who would have been perfect for the role is stuck as a seneschal and can't really take the charge that's needed because someone else had already taken the designated leader class! Admittedly, this is the one that's easiest to fix. You just have the GM assume the role of Rogue Trader and boom, no hard feelings or resentment from other players. But Rogue Trader is already a little bit slim on class choices, and it does take away from some of the draw of the system. If the GM takes over, it's sort of just Dark Heresy, but your boss wears a pirate hat instead of a pilgrim hat. Ultimately, I think Rogue Trader is a game that works a lot better as a video game than a TTRPG. I think it's a neat concept, but it was clearly undercooked. The freeform nature of the system, as well as the importance of the Rogue Traders, mean that it can be a daunting task for some GMs to run that a video game doesn't really need to concern itself with. Even then, it's very telling that Alcat sort of chose to create their own system and go with the general vibe of Rogue Trader, rather than just completely adapting the existing system. The cracks are just a little too visible for me to wholeheartedly recommend this game. The best thing I can say about this system is that it can be a good source to homebrew stuff for use in other games. If you really want to play a Rogue Trader style game, I recommend that you don't use Rogue Trader and instead go with a different system. Our next system takes us away from the high-flying adventures of the Coronis Expanse and into the back alleys and neglected sub-levels of the Ascalon sector. From the fringes of Imperial space to the heart of its planets and cities, where instead of searching for profit, you are looking to root out and destroy the mutant, the Xeno, and the heretic. This system is Dark Heresy, specifically 2nd edition. The 1st edition of Dark Heresy is just a little too dated for my tastes, and I think that everything that 1st edition does well, 2nd just does better. For the sake of simplicity, anytime I say Dark Heresy, just assume I'm talking about 2nd edition. In Dark Heresy, players are acolytes of the Inquisition, and as such are tasked with rooting out heresy wherever they may find it. Where Rogue Trader is all about fortune and glory, Dark Heresy is the opposite. It is your job to die in the dark so that the Imperium may remain in the light. Dark Heresy is a system far more focused on investigations, where players are meant to pull at threads, slowly and gradually revealing the details of what exactly they're up against. It's a lot closer to something like Call of Cthulhu than it is D&D, and I think that's perfect for a game about the Inquisition. Player characters aren't mighty heroes, they're slightly above average citizens of the Imperium. They're just the everyman, beleaguered, tired, and slowly losing both their sanity and faith. Fear, insanity, and mental trauma are all mechanics that the system has rules for, and believe me, you will use them. Especially when the party's tech priest gets a little too curious about the exact contents of a book with a huge Chaos Star stamped on the front of it. So I'm going into what I like about this system with a lot of bias. I've been playing Dark Heresy with my friends almost every Saturday for the better part of 5 years now, so it's a system that holds a special place in my heart. I'm going to try and not let that bias influence what I say too much and look at the system from an objective point of view, but I felt the need to acknowledge that that bias is certainly there. So to start, I really like character creation. Dark Heresy uses basically the standard D&D 3-step character creation process. You pick a homeworld, background, and a role. Nothing is restricted like it is with Rogue Trader's origin path, so you actually have a lot of customization when creating your character. What I like more than the vast amount of customization is how no character is locked out of talents or skill progressions. Every role can excel at stuff that isn't their designated job. One character I made was the biggest damage dealer in the party. He rocked up to every combat with an autocannon and a thunder hammer, and he had the skills to make those weapons even better than they usually were. In a single round of combat, he almost one-shotted a Lord of Change, weakening it enough for the party psyker to yeet it back into the warp the next turn. So that's a pretty damn good build for a warrior class, right? Wrong! He was a chirurgeon, the medic class in the game, and he was no slouch at healing either. Also, I should probably mention that he was an Ogren. The lack of restrictions mean you never really feel pigeonholed by your character. You don't have to just stay inside your role, and you're allowed to branch out to do other things if you want to. And if there's anything you don't like about your character, the system makes it really easy to change those things. Another thing I think Dark Heresy does really well are influence tests. Here, they really have the impact that I thought they were lacking from Rogue Trader, as influence is your only form of currency. Influence tests are how you acquire equipment, weapons, and favors, meaning it does way more than just provide a temporary bonus to some conversations. Also, the more important you grow within the Inquisition, the more your influence grows as well, meaning rare equipment is now more accessible to you than it was previously. It makes sense that your Inquisitor wouldn't trust you with a plasma gun when you were a fresh-faced recruit, but after you've grown and proven yourself, it's much easier to get your hands on one and subsequently blow yourself up with it. The thing that I like the most about Dark Heresy, though, is that it by far has the most resources of any of the systems I'll be talking about today. Initially, it may seem like Dark Heresy actually has the least amount of support, as it only has 3 source books: Enemies Within, Enemies Without, and Enemies Beyond, each dedicated to one of the 3 main orders of the Inquisition. These books add substantial content to the game by introducing new homeworlds, backgrounds, roles, and talents for player characters. However, the much more substantial support for Dark Heresy comes from a completely different RPG system: Only War. Centered on the campaigns of the Imperial Guard, Only War heavily emphasizes combat, but its rules are almost identical to Dark Heresy, allowing for seamless implementation of content such as homeworlds, weapons, and equipment from Only War into Dark Heresy. This makes it easy for Dark Heresy characters to utilize weapons from Only War, or hail from specific worlds like Cadia, Catachan, or Krieg, as Only War provides the necessary rules for them. Effectively, it means that all the sourcebooks for Only War also serve as sourcebooks for Dark Heresy, which gives the game a lot more content than it has on its own. But that's just the official stuff. There's also a bunch of fan-made content for the game that's available, such as the Radical Inquisitors Edition, the online character creator, or the absolutely invaluable resource site DH2E QuickRef, which allows you to easily find references for things like XP costs, weapon profiles, and critical hit and fear charts. This site makes the system a lot easier to run than having to pour through the core books, and is an absolutely invaluable resource. Alright, so after spending the past 2 minutes filleting Dark Heresy, you might think that it's the greatest role-playing game known to man, right? Well, Dark Heresy is far from a perfect system. Mechanical balance is probably the biggest issue that I've had with Dark Heresy. Some talents and classes are really good, while others are just absolute trash. Inescapable Attack is one such talent that is absurdly good, as it makes enemies get penalties to dodge your attacks depending on how good your attack roll was. Given how easy it is to gain bonuses to hit in this game, it makes it very likely that enemies will take massive penalties to any dodges that they attempt. Then, on the other hand, you have talents like Flash of Insight and Field Vivisection, the latter of which is, in my opinion, the worst talent in the game. Talents like these should have just been either core mechanics of the game or completely left on the cutting room floor. The roles in this game are also really imbalanced. The Fanatic role is almost identical to the Crusader role, but Crusader surpasses it in every single way. The Crusader allows for spending fate points to automatically pass fear tests and also provides a passive damage boost against enemies with a fear rating. Compare that with Fanatic, which lets you spend your fate points to gain hatred against a single enemy for the duration of combat. And that's it. Additionally, the Ace role, one that's focused on piloting vehicles, is an absolute joke, as they suffer from a major oversight as Aces lack the necessary aptitudes to actually be good at piloting vehicles, meaning they are functionally useless. Besides mechanical balance, my second biggest issue is a GM complaint, which is that Dark Heresy lacks a bestiary. For all you players out there wondering why that's such an issue, don't worry, the GMs are talking, just go back to rolling your characters. Meanwhile, all you GMs out there probably started pulling your hair out, vomiting, and pissing your pants at the mere mention of a lack of bestiary, because you know it means you have to stat out so many enemies all by yourself. While the books do have some stat blocks, there are not a lot of them. The core book has a handful of stats spread across the back pages of the book, as well as every expansion book following suit. And the stats they do cover aren't really a lot. For example, orcs only have stats for boys and knobs. That's it. If you want anything more than that, you'll have to make your own stats for them. And Dark Heresy isn't really a game where stat blocks are super easy to make. Creating NPCs for Dark Heresy is far more involved than in something like D&D, as they are essentially PCs without a homeworld background or role. You'll need to fill out characteristics, skills, talents, traits, weapons, armor values, special rules, and may the Emperor help you if they have psychic powers. Even just filling out a few enemies becomes incredibly draining, and using something like Roll20 is a must to avoid the hassle of carrying physical character sheets around everywhere. Also, you can pick up some of Only War's sourcebooks, as they have a lot of stat blocks across them, so it helps a little bit, but ultimately it's like slapping a band-aid on a gaping chest wound. Lastly, and this one is kind of a nitpick, but Dark Heresy is really hard to get a hold of physical copies of. If you're like me, you might have some issues with reading PDFs. I don't know what it is, maybe it's the ADHD in my brain, but I just find PDFs really hard to read and I prefer to have something physical in my hands. Unfortunately, Dark Heresy 2nd edition books are rare and costly, mostly due to being out of production after only a 2-year run and being plagued by stock issues while they were in production. With the partnership between Games Workshop and Fantasy Flight ending so abruptly, it also effectively made all copies of these books limited editions. Many owners are reluctant to part with their copies, and those willing to sell often ask for prices far exceeding the original MSRP. Rarely becoming available for sale, these books start at prices around $100 US, reaching $200 to $300 on average. On top of that, once you get these books, they can be in pretty poor quality regardless of how the previous owner treated them. The binding of the core book was apparently composed of spit and prayers, and as a result, no matter how delicately you treat it, it might just start falling apart on its own. If you do get a hold of a copy, I'd suggest getting it rebound if you can, but at that point you'd be paying even more after buying an already expensive book. And if you want to keep it in its original condition, then it's basically just shelf decoration and will never really get used. And as shelf decoration, Dark Heresy 2nd edition kind of sucks. I mean, the cover isn't even really that cool to look at. I mean, it's got some nice art on it, but it's not like Liber Xenologist, where I mean, like, yeah, that's just a cool book to see on a shelf. Put a cool skull next to it, hell yeah. But even after saying all that, I still completely and wholeheartedly recommend Dark Heresy 2nd edition. It is still an absolutely excellent system despite the flaws that it has. It certainly could have used some stoning and polishing with its balance, and I really wish that the books were better made. But I feel like the things that this system does right far outweighs the flaws that it has. I mean, if I didn't like it, I probably wouldn't have played it for 5 years straight. The flaws are an issue, but I mean, they're not completely game ruining. But that being said, if you're looking for an RPG specifically like Rogue Trader, I might find something else. It's totally very different from what Rogue Trader offers. If you want something that's an RPG version of Darktide, then yeah, go for it. But for Rogue Trader, something else might be better suited for you. Now, before we get on to our last system, there's just a bit of housekeeping I want to take care of. A majority of you who found this channel and are watching this video are probably here from WillamSRD's community. So, I just wanted to take a minute and give a big thanks to Will for the shoutout. I really appreciate it. Additionally, the outpouring of support on the bolt gun video has been absolutely incredible to see. You guys have been really awesome, and I'm hoping you'll like the content that I have planned for the future. Additionally, while I have you here, has all this talk about role-playing games got you in the mood for more RPG content? If the answer to that question is yes, then may I humbly recommend you the channel Handful of Nerds. Handful of Nerds is a joint effort between Jacob Crowe of Crowe's Perch, Latula of LatulaArts, M of AuntieHauntie, formerly known as Unimportant Hero, Austin, who is WillamSRD's podcast co-host, and I'm also here for some reason. Handful of Nerds is all about playing role-playing games that you might not know about or have always been curious about, but there isn't really much content online about them. So rest assured, we aren't just yet another D&D 5e actual play. Our first playtest has been of Modifius's Fallout TTRPG system, and it's been really fun so far. And who knows, maybe at some point we'll play some 40k RPGs, huh? But if that channel sounds interesting to you, go check us out and maybe subscribe if you like what you see. Anyway, back to the 40k RPGs. The last game we'll be taking a look at today is the most recent one to be released, and the one that I think has the most potential, Imperium Maledictum. Published by Cubicle 7, Imperium Maledictum is a sort of spiritual successor to Dark Heresy. But unlike Dark Heresy, Imperium Maledictum has a lot broader of a focus. Instead of working for just the Inquisition, players serve a patron that is a representative from one of 9 different factions. They could be a representative from a rogue trader dynasty, the Imperial Guard, the Ecclesiarchy, or even an infractionist crime lord. Aside from that though, the system is very similar to Dark Heresy, but it mostly takes what worked about Dark Heresy and refined it to smooth over most of the jank that the system had. It winds up in this sweet spot where it's a lot easier to understand for newcomers, but it doesn't really sacrifice much mechanical depth by doing so. It's simplified, but not simple. I remember when this game was initially announced, me and my gaming group were absolutely psyched to be getting a successor to one of our favorite RPG systems. We all pre-ordered a copy as soon as we could, and I even bought the special edition with the fancy cover. We got our first chance to play the system around May of last year, and honestly, it completely lived up to all the hype we had for it. The thing I probably like the most about Imperium Maledictum is the patron system. In Dark Heresy, your boss was more or less just some shadowy dude who you worked for, and it was very easy to make them the generic stern inquisitor. Sure, they might join you in the field at some point, but generally the party could feel kind of detached from them. Not the case with the patrons of Imperium Maledictum. Patrons are made to be created in tandem by the players and the GM, making it a collaborative experience that ensures that players will probably be a lot more attached to whoever is signing their checks. Additionally, patrons provide players with boons and liabilities. Boons are bonuses that are provided to the party, whereas liabilities are, well, liabilities, the hazards that come with the job. For example, you might get a sororitas canoness as your patron, and her boon might be to give every single person their very own bolt pistol or bolt gun. But that firepower may come with certain drawbacks or things that your boss expects of you. They could require you to spread the word of the Emperor wherever you go, or that you purge any psychers that you find, or they could just be a miserly bastard and underpay you. This stuff helps to make a patron more than just the boss, and makes them a character players have a vested interest in working with and pleasing rather than just because they're a big scary inquisitor. Additionally, the various factions your patron can be from can allow for a lot of different campaigns. As much as I love Dark Heresy, every campaign in that game basically had the same plot. You find the heresy, you stop the heresy. But with Imperium Maledictum, you could find yourself digging up Archaeotech for a Mechanicus Magos or running chems for a crime lord. It really does a lot to add a ton of freshness and variety to the game, so that you never feel like you're playing the same campaign twice. Another thing I really like about Imperium Maledictum is how it somewhat abstracts some things. In most system, combat maps look like this. Good old grid-based combat, we've all seen it, we've all played with it. But in Imperium Maledictum, combat looks like this, where the map is split into multiple zones. I really like this. I think it's a unique and interesting way to have combat without getting way too crunchy like some other systems have it. With combat zones, there's a lot less concern for exact placement, but it isn't completely insignificant. In combat, you can move freely around a zone you currently occupy, but have to spend your move to move into an adjacent one. There's no worrying about someone being just out of your range to engage in melee, or just outside of optimal firearm range, since it can only be in short, medium, long, or extreme distances. I think it strikes a perfect balance between theater of the mind and having a battle map. GMs can just draw a few zones on a blank whiteboard if they want to, while those who want a little bit more complexity can make their own maps and divide them into zones, and then add features like cover to them as well. It also means that if you're playing in person, your table doesn't have to be taken up completely by a huge board for combat encounters. GMs can just print out maps on a single sheet of paper, draw some lines on them with pencil, and use those for your fights. It leaves a lot more room on the table for other things, such as dice in their trays, character sheets, minis, and your player's third Mountain Dew that they will proceed to spill all over everything. Keeping on the topic of abstraction, weapon profiles have also been simplified, giving them significantly less paperwork for players. In previous games, you'd have to track every single shot in your weapon, and that could end up being a real pain. For example, the lasgun has a 60-round magazine, and it is a lot to ask people to track 60 rounds of ammo. Asking players to meticulously keep track of ammo ends up leading to a lot of accidental, dirty, hairy moments, where players are sitting there asking themselves,
You're thinking, did he fire 6 shots or only 5?
Reloading was also kind of unimportant in something like Dark Heresy. For one, you can reload for free outside of combat, but also weapons deal so much damage and have such deep magazines that I've rarely had to reload in the middle of combat. A bolt gun has 24 rounds to a mag, and also deals 1d10 plus 5 Pen 4 explosive damage. If something is still standing after a 24 round mag dump from a bolt gun, then I think reloading is the least of your problems. Most guns in Imperium Maledictum, however, have a magazine size that is less than 10, which is much easier to keep track of, and makes magazine size and reloading actually matter due to the much smaller size. Additionally, weapons no longer roll dice to determine damage. Damage is now determined by how many success levels you had on your attack roll. Previously, depending on the dice, you could either take shots from a lasgun like their butterfly kisses, or they would rapidly connect you to the Emperor's Wi-Fi. With damage now based on success levels, it's much easier to know how hard you can hit or are about to get hit with a weapon. You never have to worry about getting a perfect shot, firing, hitting, they fail their dodge, and then you deal minimum damage. It's also much easier to know what attacks you should dodge and what attacks you can probably just tank. In previous systems, you dodged before damage was determined, meaning that you had no way of knowing if you just dodged something lethal or if you just dodged a mere tickle. But damage being based on success levels now lets you make an informed decision on when you should use your valuable dodge. It also means that frag grenades are no longer terrible, so that's good. But if all that abstraction turns you away from the system, don't worry. Imperium Maledictum has thought of that and has provided you with rules to play the game a lot more crunchy and meticulous if you prefer. On pages 313 and 314 of the core book, they have rules for playing with grid-based combat as well as counting every shot in a magazine. They even include advice for playing without a grid or zones and using a tape measure to measure movement and range like it's a regular game of 40k. Honestly, I really want to try that last one out for myself. Moving on to what I don't like, and honestly, I don't really have too much bad stuff to say about Imperium Maledictum. I mean, it's mostly really nitpicks. For me, the biggest issue is that Imperium Maledictum is currently lacking a lot of content. The game just launched properly at the end of 2023 and has some fairly slim options for character creation at the moment. Dark Heresy launched with 8 roles, and through its sourcebooks it now has 12. Imperium Maledictum launched with 6 roles, and at the time of this video's publication currently has no sourcebooks. On top of that, things like weapons, armor, and equipment feel a little lacking in choice as well. So Imperium Maledictum is an RPG that currently just feels a little bit too slim with its options. We know sourcebooks are on the way, with the first ones being focused around the Inquisition, but we don't know the exact contents of those sourcebooks. So for all we know, the character options we have in the core book could be all we get. But probably not. Look, Cubicle 7 has never really been shy about adding substantial new content to their RPGs with the source books, so I don't really think it's going to be an issue for Imperium Maledictum. I like to try and keep my negatives evergreen, and this one will probably go away with time, but it is something to keep in mind if you want to start playing right now. Another thing I'm not really a big fan of is the influence system this game has. It's supposed to be a measurement of how friendly of terms you're on with a specific faction and how easy it is to convince them to help you out. Positive influence is good, negative influence is bad, but something about it just doesn't really click for me. I think it's a little too video gamey for my tastes. Something about knowing exactly numerically how much a faction likes you is just a little weird for me. Having my GM tell me I gained +2 influence with a faction feels like seeing that "you are now vilified by Caesar's Legion" pop up I get in every single New Vegas playthrough I do. The last issue I have is the name. Good God, Imperium Maledictum. Is there anything that rolls off the tongue less? Look, I understand why Cubicle 7 couldn't call it Dark Heresy 3rd Edition, since it's no longer focused on just the Inquisition. But did you have to give it a title that feels like a 12-car pile-up in the mouth? Why not just call it Dark Imperium? It means practically the same thing as Imperium Maledictum and clearly marks it as a spiritual successor to Dark Heresy. Sure, there's a book series of that same title, and the 8th edition box set is also called that, but come on, Games Workshop reuses titles for things all the time. Depending on the context, saying Rogue Trader could be referring to 5 different things. I don't think anyone is going to think that this is actually this. I know 40k loves its pseudo-Latin, but did you really have to call the RPG something that sounds like a Twitter account with a Roman statue profile pic? But all that is mostly just nitpicking, and I have no real issue recommending Imperium Maledictum. I think it has an incredibly bright future for a 40k RPG, and my own group has basically started to shelve our copies of Dark Heresy in favor of Imperium Maledictum. With some well-balanced rules and a bunch of sourcebooks on the horizon, I think it's safe to say that Imperium Maledictum is an excellent choice for anyone interested in 40k roleplaying, and is definitely the game that I have the easiest time recommending that you play. Now, those 3 are by no means the only 40k RPGs that exist, but they're all that I have time to talk about in this video. There's a ton more that I haven't even touched on, but if I covered every 40k RPG at once, I think at its shortest this video would be like 2 hours long. It would also mean that I can't milk them for future content, so, you know, there's that as well. Obviously, the one that I recommend the most is Imperium Maledictum, and the one I recommend the least is Rogue Trader. But really, just play whatever you want and sounds interesting to you. It ultimately just comes down to personal taste. You might find the flaws in Rogue Trader insubstantial and be able to look past them and enjoy the system way more than I can. Whereas while I may love Dark Heresy, you may find its rules too clunky and finicky to work for you. I mean, whatever you like, and I am by no means the authority on what a good RPG is. I mean, I hate Pathfinder. That opinion alone should be enough to get me crucified. But there's such a wide variety of 40k RPGs that speaking authoritatively on which one's the best and which one's the worst is really stupid. They each have their own peaks and valleys, things they do well, things they do bad. No matter what you like, there's probably a 40k RPG somewhere out there that's perfectly suited to your tastes. Whether that be the roleplay and investigation-heavy Imperium Maledictum, the profit-focused Rogue Trader, or the incredibly combat-heavy system Deathwatch. The only way to know if you like it is to go out there and actually play it, form your own opinions. And even then, you don't have to stick to the licensed 40k RPGs. I mean, you could probably run a 40k RPG out of something like GURPS. I mean, it's a generic universal role-playing system for a reason. And the subreddit 40k RPG has had a massive ongoing project to convert Warhammer 40k to D&D 5th edition. If you're interested in that, there's a link in the description. But I'm curious what you guys think. If there are any 40k RPGs that you've played, licensed or otherwise, let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. But that's my time for today, guys. I'm Zosh, you've been watching the Zosh Box. Remember that spit makes for the best bookbinding, and I'll see you in the next one.